Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time you happen to be watching it. It's evening while we film it. We're filming it a bit later than normal. Uh, Jen, do you want to tell people what happened?
I'm afraid that I too have the cron. So yeah, so I haven't actually been tested or anything like that, and I seem to be mostly fine. But I'm just telling you to warn you that there's a reason why my complexion is a little waxy, and I'm sure that my articulation may not be completely up to snuff. You're going to get a B plus performance from me at best on this episode. No, there were three confirmed COVID cases in my son's kindergarten class, and so everybody was basically sent home to isolate, and then my son was sent home with a cough and a fever. So, like, statistically speaking, yeah, we all have the Omicron. So that's
You
just what it
know,
is. So we're isolating. We're just being reasonable about it.
I don't
It's
know if it
fine.
was it last week's video or the week before where
Yeah,
I
you
was,
probably had it. Yeah.
but unlike, see, you at least have a nexus, like to a direct exposure. You can say, my son was exposed. We then saw him, and then we got sick. Whereas for my wife and I, it was, I mean, we had taken, ironically, our kids out to get vaccinated. And,
Yeah.
because at the time Ontario was planning on returning to school in the classroom on schedule, my wife is a teacher and I got two elementary age kids. So we were like, you know what, let's do all of our family stuff and socializing in the first half of the break. And then after Christmas, which we hosted, we're just going to lay low. Like, and we're going to chill. We're going to just do our own thing. And it'll be really, really great, with one exception. We got to go out and get the kids vaccinated. 2 days after that, my wife got a sore throat, an achy back, and then head congestion, and then a cough. And then about 2 days after her getting that, I got the same thing. It was 5 or 6 days of various symptoms, and it was gone. And I'm never going to know what it was, and neither are you, because there's no
No,
test.
because we can't test it. But I mean, like, we have to assume it is. Like, I've got a little bit of sore throat, a little bit of tiredness, and like ness. But like, other than that, like, honestly, it's been very mild for me. And I actually think that there is a real difference in the experience of this, whether you have Delta or Omicron. But I suspect we have Omicron, just because of the timing of it all. But like, for us, mild cold, mild cold. I mean, if you have kids, you have been exposed to worse flus than this in the last 5 years. But that's been just our experience. Who knows what,
Were
you know?
you, I don't think you were in Toronto then. I don't remember the 6 months you actually spent with the Post editorial board in person. Were you there for the U.S. consulate meeting? I don't think you were.
I don't think so, no.
So that was the story I tell at my own expense, where I felt terrible. I woke up one day feeling terrible, but I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to power through. It's like a Thursday or Friday. I'm going to get to the end of this week. I'm going to drink hot fluids, rest this weekend. This is when my daughter was little. She was 1 and she was at daycare. Daycares are just bioweapon laboratory.
Oh, 100% they are. Yeah.
And I sort of was like, I'm just going to power through whatever this is. So I was down at the U.S. consulate. I was doing all these meetings. The whole ed board was there. It was fun. It was good. Nice conversation back in a different era. And then about a week later, I'm still feeling terrible. I'm taking like NyQuil and taking Dayquil, doing all the stuff, working hard. And I get out of bed one morning and I just fall over, like just like a tree, timber, boom. And I'm like, oh, weird. My balance is shot. So what I thought was a head cold was a staph infection in my ears. And
Oh,
apparently, who knew? You should not ignore bacterial infections. I ended up missing 2 full weeks of work after that. And that's just been my lesson. When don't
yeah.
don't be
My
dumb.
my son actually had meningitis when he was 2 weeks old.
Holy shit.
Yeah, it was a big deal. And we had to go to Children's Hospital, and they did.
Viral or bacterial?
Well, we think now it was viral
Yeah.
because he had the meningital stuff, and he had to have like a the spinal tap stuff. Like, he's
Yeah.
had to have spinal fluid withdrawn. And we were in Children's Hospital for I think 2 weeks, like in like the full on care unit, and they were flushing him full of the highest dose antibacterial as they can, because apparently it takes 72 hours to get back the cultures from
I don't know.
the and so they don't know, so they
No,
have to assume it's bacterial, and like, he had an MRI. It was a whole big deal.
I don't
That was
know.
horrifying,
I
but it
don't know
turned
if
out to be viral.
I don't know if you know this. I've written about it, so it's public knowledge. This is basically my parental post-traumatic stress disorder. When I was a kid, when I was 11, I didn't know her well. She was my sister knew her. I kid we knew died. And it was she was a bit older than me, so she was like 12, 13. I was grade 5, she was grade 6 or 7, and she had like mild fever, felt tired. Parents put her to bed, never woke up. Bacterial meningitis can kill you incredibly quickly.
Oh, holy
And
shit, can it ever?
so we had like a doc. I mean, it's funny, we talk now all the time about public health. We had a doc come into the school and tell us about bacterial meningitis, what the warning signs are, what the symptoms are. And
yeah, and I remember because Jamie was like, again, he was only a couple weeks old, and he was like gray basically, and he started to get the splotches.
yeah,
And we got into triage, and they were like, boom, back. And like he was like, they put him on bacteria within like an hour of us being in the door. Like they did not mess around. They were just like, this is meningitis. Like they took his white blood cell count, and it was something like a normal white blood cell count is something like 10, and like his white blood cell count in his spinal fluid was like 1,000. Like it was like he had full-blown meningitis. It was a huge thing. And for a long time we were very nervous that he had hearing loss damage and all kinds of he would have mental disabilities and things. That the MRIs all came back fine. He seemed to be okay. Like, I'm always going to kind of wonder whether or not his autism was related to that, but I don't know. And like it's just, I'm not unempathetic or unfamiliar with what it's like to have a seriously sick child, is what I'm trying to say here. Like I've been there, like a lot of parents, I've been there, and I understand that. And I hope that, I don't know how much we're going to keep in there here, but I hope that listeners who listen to this don't think that you and I are just shooting the shit about COVID numbers, not taking it seriously. Meanwhile, some immunocompromised kid or some seriously ill child in the hospital gets COVID, and like we don't understand or are totally. I completely understand. I'm not callous about this. I know what it's like to have a seriously ill child.
The bacterial meningitis stuff scares the shit out of me. And that doctor, when I was in grade 5, I think it was, told us the 3 warning symptoms are fever, splotchy skin, and a sore neck. And I remember, like, I can remember this, like, this is an alarming number of years ago, almost 30 years ago. And I remember him saying a fever, spots on your skin, or a sore neck are a hassle. A fever, spots on your skin, and a sore neck all at the same time is come see me. And in 2019, and this is a column I've dined out on ever since, it ended up working out great for me. In the spring of 2019, my son, who was at the time 4, went to bed early with a fever, didn't feel well, woke up in the middle of the night, came in a room, says, I don't feel well, put him in bed with us, and he was quite hot. Woke up the next morning and he had spots on his skin, and he started to say, my neck hurts. And so, like I said before, this is my parental PTSD. And I was like, okay, that's fine, buddy. No problem. Give me a second. Called my mom. My parents lived not too far away from me. And I'm like, Mom, I don't have time to explain to you, but I need you to be at my house in 90 seconds. And my mom, to her credit, went, okay. And like click, and then my mom shows up, and in those 90 seconds, 2 minutes, like basically enough time for her to grab her keys, put on her shoes and coat, get in the car, and drive over. I had explained to my wife, who I had not previously told about all my PTSD, okay, honey, whatever your morning plans are, we're going to the hospital right now, so pack a day bag for him, and I'll throw some stuff in a bag for you and I, like a phone charger, stuff like that. And we were out the door, like, again, probably 3 minutes after my son told us that he had a sore neck. We were out the door. And hospital for sick kids in Toronto, 20 minutes from our house. I made it in about 10 because I was breaking all the traffic rules. And what I remember, I took him into the triage nurse, and the triage nurse at sick kids is just permanently bedraggled and exhausted, right? Like they just have one of the worst jobs in the city. And I'm like, my son has a fever, splotchy skin, and a sore neck. And her game face just
came down.
Yeah. And she went, and I remember she looked at me and she said, sir, I understand what you're telling me. And I was like, okay. Like, it was just like, we understood each other.
Yeah.
And then she said, I'm sending you to that room right there. And we just went and we sat in that room, and I'm saying to him, I said, Hey, don't worry, buddy. Sometimes it takes a minute. Boom, doctor, like just
Yeah.
like right in. And
Yeah.
he's like, hey, yep. And he's got stethoscope on. And then right behind him, nurse comes in, pushing an ultrasound cart and a technician for it. And then another doctor's there in 2 minutes. As much as you and I have talked about the dysfunction in Canadian healthcare, before COVID came along and crushed it, that was what it was good at. Like that was always the bargain.
They knew
right?
how to, yeah, they know how to triage. And actually, well, what happened to your son? I want to hear the end of the story.
You know what they did? It was incredible. They checked with the ultrasound his neck. And the guy said to me, he says, if it's bacterial meningitis, we're not going to see anything. He says, what, like he says, but if it's a normal kind of viral cold thing, we're going to see swollen lymph nodes. He says, if I see swollen lymph nodes, you guys go home with Tylenol. If I don't, this kid's admitted immediately to begin what your son went through. And my wife and I are just sitting there baffled, right? We've been at the hospital 15 minutes and our son has been stripped naked. He's got, they're checking all the spots, like they're giving his whole body a check. And the ultrasound tech starts doing the thing up and down his neck. And both doctors are hovering over it, staring at it. And they look at each other. And one of them looked at me and just thumbs up, just gave me a thumbs up. He says, your kid's fine. He goes, we don't know what it is, but I know it's not bacterial meningitis. And he says, it's a damn good thing you came in. And he said, the nurse told me that you knew what you were dealing with. She wanted to know, are you a doctor? And I said, no, but I've seen this thing before. Like, I know it. I know what this.
And this is,
and we were home an hour later.
And this is so interesting because when my son went in with meningitis, he was diagnosed with meningitis. By the end of our stay, like we were literally getting like the sick kids specialized infectious disease.
Yeah.
Like their top guy was coming in and visiting it because we couldn't figure out what it was. And his petri dishes, they grow the bacteria and they basically, yeah, they do cultures, sorry. So they do cultures to see what grows, and nothing was growing in any of his cultures. So they were just like, if it was bacterial, something would be growing. But the problem is like it takes a couple days for them to know for sure that nothing's growing in the cultures.
So you got to treat it as if it is.
You got to treat it as if it is.
He'll die before they get the
he'll die before he gets the cultures back. So they basically were like, it has to be viral, like because nothing's growing in his fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. So it's got to be viral. But by that point, we'd been taken through the ringer. So anyway, that's a whole other side story. The other interesting thing that I thought was when you were telling your story about your son and triaging, I was reminded of giving birth to Elizabeth, and I'm a good breeder, so I was quite good.
I've read that on some of the boards.
Yeah. When the Handmaid's Tale comes down, I'm not getting sent over to the mines. It's pretty much so. Everything. I was induced with Elizabeth because she was super big. Like I had gestational diabetes, very marginal, and they'd done the ultrasounds, and she was like predicted like 9+ pounds. Like she was, and like I don't know if you saw me, but like I was literally like able to put a coffee cup on I was huge. So anyway, when we were giving birth, I was warned, like there's a shoulder dystocia risk. There's a real disproportion between her head and her shoulders. There's a risk she's going to get stuck because she was my husband's child and therefore, giant tank baby. But anyway, so everything was going fine. She was induced. Everything was going fine until the moment when my water broke. And then I went from like the slowest, most agonizing, annoying 3-day labor to all of a sudden on like fucking Donkey Kong. And I like literally from the point where my water burst, I went from 4 centimeters to 10 centimeters in 45 minutes. And I gave birth, like I got her out in 11. But I went from completely fine, everything's normal, to all of a sudden baby's in distress, mom's screaming in pain in the course of like maybe 15 minutes. And the nurse next to me starts freaking out. She's bringing in, like, and all of a sudden, so like she started losing it. And so my husband was like, code it. And so she codes it. And by the time she finishes coding it, like everybody comes running into comes running in because the baby was in distress. And I remember having this distinct moment where I was freaking out because like the epidural wasn't working. I was losing my mind. And like this old, 25-year veteran nurse looks at me and she was like, check or something. So she looks at me and she's just like, basically like, you need to get in, figure out what's going on here, or the surgical team's going to come and that's not going to be good for you. And I remember looking her straight in the eye and saying, you're telling me I need to get my shit together. And she's like, well, I can't say that. And I look at my husband and I goes, but he can. And Alex looks at me, he goes, you need to get your shit together. And I'm like, very well. Ka-donk. And I went right into like crisis mode. And I pushed that baby out in 11 minutes flat. They managed to get her out without any kind of like a surgical, anything like that. They just kind of swished her around and like no tearing, nothing, pushed her out. They put her on the scale. She was 9 pounds, 11 ounces. The
Baby.
NICU nurses start like, and the surgical people start piling into the rooms. There was like 20 people in the room at some point. My husband tells me because I can't remember. And the NICU nurses are looking at this giant, massive, fat baby, and they're like, "Oh, she's so cute. We don't see them this big very, very often. Like, this is great." Meanwhile, Dvorchka, the nurse, is pulling out my placenta like a prize fish, basically saying that this is the largest placenta she's ever seen in her life. It was like, she's like, it's so huge. Look at it.
Look at this, everybody.
Look at this, everybody. And I'm just like, I'm good. Everything's fine by me. But yeah, this is true. When the healthcare system is not under supreme stress, they do triage very well.
Yeah. See, they
handle emergency well.
I wrote a column about this in the Post in 2019 because my son really burned a lot of OHIP for a couple of months there because we had this not meningitis panic run to the hospital. And then a few months later, he's just goofing around and he falls. Like he was just being a total goof. We were walking up the steps to a shop. Instead of walking up the steps like an adult, he's like twirling and swinging his arms around. And he falls. He busts his arm. And we take him to the local hospital. And it's kind of like, hey, sorry, man. Like we just got 2 cardiacs arrive. Like no doctors for you, child with broken bone. Like, and it was just, and I wrote this column at the time saying that what the Canadian healthcare system is good at is saving your life in an emergency. What it is bad at is anything between like you need like the banana antibiotics and you need open heart surgery. Like that's the spot where the system is bad. And the thing is, I'm not convinced COVID hasn't broken even that model. I mean, right now, you and I will both know of people. I know of at least 3 people in real life who are waiting on important surgeries that they can't get.
And our neighbors had to have his hip surgery replaced or put off for like 6 months now. Like it's a thing.
It's insane what I'm hearing about. I know one woman who basically needs surgery and the doctor's like, I can't give you the surgery you need, but I can give you like a laparoscopic tide you over for a year procedure in like kind of like a day procedure that will prevent this from getting worse. And then in a year or 2, hopefully we can actually do the procedure. What's funny too, though, we'll move on to actually what we want to talk about. We burned a lot of time talking about this. I think everybody has like a tough as nails nurse story because about 5 years ago, I woke up one day and I had like a sore back. It was like a mildly sore back. And I thought to myself, oh, I slept weird last night. Like, and then the next day it's like, this really hurts. I'm going to take a nice long hot shower. The next day, I remember specifically was a Friday and I'm like, my back is fucking killing me. And I hadn't done anything that I was aware of. So I'm like, maybe I'll get a massage this weekend. By Saturday, we tried to take the kids to a movie and I had to say to my wife, I got to go walk around the lobby. I cannot be sitting. By Sunday, I was crawling into a hospital. And I remember like this doctor, the guy was like a total dude bro doctor. So I'm a big guy. I have a fairly high pain tolerance and I'm crawling down the corridor at Sunnybrook trying to get to the emergency room. And this guy's like, how you doing, buddy? What's wrong with you? And I think he thought I was either like a psych case or I was high. And I said to him, I know this looks pathetic right now, but I cannot straighten my body. And he goes, oh, okay. And then he immediately drops the dude bro thing. He goes, oh, okay, hang on. He picks up a phone, calls some guys. These 2 orderlies show up, and these were not big guys. They picked me up like I was like made of styrofoam, and they got me on a gurney, and they took me right to the ER. And the doc's pumping me full of questions. And he goes to me, he goes, look, I'm the attending OR emergency room physician tonight, the surgeon. And he says, what you're telling me, I think, is appendicitis. And I'd actually kind of already concluded it might have been appendicitis. And the guy said to me, he goes, we're going to get you checked out. Like, we're going to do this really fast because if it's appendicitis, I want you on my operating table in the next 20 minutes. Yeah. And he goes, don't worry about it. Like, this is a really easy surgery. But if you're in this much pain, I want this thing out of you immediately. So I'm lying on this stretcher in the ER. And he's telling the nurse who's got like the papers and she's writing stuff down, and she just kind of looks at him. She goes, no, I don't think this is appendicitis. She looks at me, she says, roll onto your side, which I can barely do at this point. So she helps me. She takes one finger and she goes, boop, and she pokes it into me, and I scream. And I have a fairly high pain tolerance. I have walked on a broken ankle. I can't do this. But I was like, ah! And she goes, kidney stone.
Yeah.
And she like, and I was just like over. And then the doc's like, oh, okay. And then the orderlies are like, oh, kidney stone, no problem. I'd never had a kidney stone before, never had one since. They imaged my insides. They said there were no others. It was probably just bad luck that I had one. They flushed me full of fluid and morphine. I had an amazing night at Sunnybrook. I had a great time. I made friends with the singing lamp. And then they kept asking me to try to pee. And like the first 3 times, nothing happened. And then all of a sudden I felt this weird thing in my body, but I didn't care because the lamps were singing. And then I could pee. And the nurse said to me, she's like, you're going to feel bad tomorrow. You're going to feel worse the next day. You're going to feel even worse the next day. The 4th day, you're going to wish you were dead. And then you're going to start feeling better. And that's exactly what happened. So
these are great stories. I now want to share all of our medical stories, but I do think we need to get to the dispatch.
Talk about some other stuff. All right.
We do need to talk about, I mean, I really now do want to share the story about like how the anesthesiologist fucked up my epidural, and like I wound up going back into emergency and basically telling them that there was they had punctured my epidural, one of the walls of my spine. Like I diagnosed myself correctly. They didn't believe me, but they fixed it with like this crazy blood patch thing that they do. Anyway, we don't need to regale our war stories of the Canadian medical system, although that actually would be an interesting thing to do one time. But I really do think that we should get to our dispatch because we've been going on for a while.
Let's do it then. Let me just mention, we can cover this pretty briefly. I was feeling cheeky on Thursday.
Okay.
What honestly happened is I was expecting to have a call at like, and it was delayed half an hour, and I was just sitting there. I was like, well, I feel cheeky. And I tweeted out something. Let me pull it up. Let me actually read it verbatim. This was just me being deliberately cheeky. So let me tell you what I said. What I said was, this is the direct quote. I'm reading the tweet. Doug Ford has managed the pandemic badly. The long-term care and healthcare systems were disasters long before he took office. You're welcome. Those are 2 statements that ought not to be controversial. My mentions blew up with people who wanted to argue with me about it.
So this is what I've discovered, is that we've now reached the point in the pandemic where the more obvious and sane the thing you say on Twitter is, the more
hostile
people,
the reaction.
Yeah, the more hostile the reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've discovered this to my chagrin in the last few weeks myself, but it's like, I'm going to make a very obvious and rational statement based on the facts at hand.
Oh, we can't.
Explosions. And it seems like the more sensible what you're saying is, the worse it becomes.
Yeah. And I again, this is the column I need to get around to writing sooner rather than later, because I have all of the raw material in place. I just have not had the time to actually sit down and write this thing. We're in a situation right now where I honestly believe, and by the way, this is not to deny any of the objective problems we have. We have real challenges right now, but I think people are so locked in their takes that the ability to look at evidence of any kind and go, yeah, you know, the old saying, right? Like, when the facts change, so does my opinion. I don't think we can change our opinions now. I just think we're locked into them. So that'll just be something like I'll mention for fun, but I think we are in a, you had that column, it was great. And I just don't say this to blow smoke up your nether regions. Like you had that column a few months ago about, if you're crazy, would you know it?
Yeah, everybody's crazy now.
I think everybody's about that crazy so much.
Yes.
Because my gut feeling, and I'm not saying this to be judgmental of anyone, but my gut feeling is that we will have an opportunity 5 years from now in the post-COVID world, and hopefully a shining utopia of pleasure,
sensible, yes, rational.
And I think some of us will look back at like what we were saying at this time and be like, who the fuck was that person? Like, I do think this is something that is both a comment on us as individuals, but also societally. We're not bringing our A game right now. Like,
everybody's losing it. Everybody's losing it.
And this is going to be, if there are other problems that come up, we're going to go into them exhausted, psyched out, frustrated, angry. Not a good place to be. We've already talked so much about hospitals. Do you want to talk more about hospitals? You were planning on
Yeah,
writing.
so we were something we were going to talk about last week, but I never really got around to it because I just wasn't feeling it. Is that comparing the hospital situation in sort of Alberta and the West to the hospital situation in Ontario and Quebec is now
Yeah.
increasingly interesting to me. It looks like sort of Quebec is actually sort of peaking out and reaching record-breaking ICU cases. I haven't looked
Are
specifically
they?
at
I've been looking at Quebec.
yeah, I think Quebec is actually in the shit. I think that I'll now correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to have to double check this, but Ontario's hospitalizations are really high, but your ICUs are not. And in fact, your
Correct.
ICUs are better than the
Well, no,
Ontario
ICUs are
Science
high,
tables.
but they're not record breaking.
They're not
They're a
record
lot
breaking.
higher than we want them to be.
Sure, of course. But I do think that you guys are better than the Ontario Science Table's best case scenario predictions.
I'd have to
And
look
then in
at it
Alberta,
but what if we're not better? We're in the best case scenario range.
you're in the
I
best
haven't
case
looked
scenario.
at it exactly, but yeah, no, it's
Sure.
not nearly as bad as they forecast.
So, and then here's what's also interesting is that I'm looking at Alberta because this is where I am. Again, hospitalizations are high, but our ICUs are really low.
Mhm.
Like our ICUs are less than a third of where they were during our last peak. So, and I don't want to draw any conclusions here, but and also Kenney came out today and said, like, if we're looking at our wastewater, it looks like we've peaked on Omicron. So
Yeah.
we are probably only a week behind you guys, not much further. So it's not like you can say, well, Alberta's 3 weeks behind. We're not. So I think that that's worth observing. Just make a fairly straightforward observation of the facts. My theory as to why that's happened is because when Delta ripped through in the fall, it essentially just burned through, and there just probably wasn't the same level of immunologically naive people in Alberta. There just weren't that many vulnerable people left.
Could also be, yeah, maybe. Like, I don't know. This is two non-doctors speculating, but I also
Totally,
wonder.
yeah.
I also wonder if because our second and third waves were basically simultaneous last spring, they scared the bejesus out of everybody. Everybody got vaccinated as soon as possible. You guys waited. Alberta was slow to vaccinate. You might just be at the higher efficacy level of that second shot.
Maybe, and also at the same time, like we had under vaccinated pockets. I mean, if you go look at the per capita and look at like the regional per capita rates of like COVID deaths and COVID cases, a lot of it's rural. Well, astonishing amount of it is rural, which is why we had that last wave, why we got kicked so hard in the teeth on Delta. So that was really interesting. And then the other thing too is that our vaccination rate actually went up dramatically after our last wave. So not only does maybe our vaccination rate is more recent, but it is more recent because a lot of people got vaccinated at least with their second, third doses in the last few months. So that could be it. So it's like there's a lot of interesting speculation as to why that could be happening, but I do think that it's worth noting that for all of the loudness on the hospital situation in Alberta and Quebec, it doesn't seem to be the same situation in other places in the country. And I would like to raise that attention. And I'd like to raise that attention because this goes into another item I'd want to mention in the dispatch. And that is, it seems to me that as it becomes more and more obvious that Omicron is indeed a relatively mild form of COVID. And in fact, I will even go so far as to say it is mild. Now, of course, we've had the debate about the use of the word mild or the misuse of the word mild. Of course, it's not mild to the individuals who got seriously ill by it.
Or the unvaccinated. Like it'll still rip you if you're unvaccinated.
It'll still be a nasty illness if you're unvaccinated. But, you know, you can also say that about a mild form of food poisoning. Of course, the food poisoning isn't mild to the person who winds up in the hospital with it, right? But that doesn't mean that 99% of the people who get the case of food poisoning, it's mild, right? Like that's what the word mild means in the English language prior to 3 weeks ago. So the thing that I wanted to say is that as it becomes more obvious that Omicron is indeed a relatively mild illness, the people who 3 or 4 weeks ago put their reputations in their faces on the idea that this was going to be the big bad and this was going to collapse society, blah, 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 are going to emphasize the bad data points and de-emphasize the good data points in order to save face. So I'm kind of expecting paradoxically that as the danger rapidly passes on Omicron, and it is rapidly passing, we are going to see a lot more hysteria rather than less about just how bad it is or how bad it was.
You know, it's interesting, right? Because I'm naturally cautious in my language. I don't know if I would describe Omicron as mild. I would just say it's milder. And The only thing I find remarkable about Omicron is its infectivity. And
Yes.
we were talking a few minutes ago, not at the beginning, because
we've discussed that at length on previous dispatches, right?
we don't need to get into it now.
Yeah.
I was talking just a few minutes ago, though. I don't think we're rational right now. Like, I think on a societal level, we are not rational. And we covered this mostly last week when we talked about how you mentioned that it's more mild and people get their backs up. And like, I think we're at the point now where I can cheekily tweet what ought to be uncontroversially true statements, factually accurate, no one would contest that, and people get mad because I think right now, like, we are moving in a weird way. And I'm not declaring the pandemic over, because when you've peaked, that means you're halfway done. Like, the peak is the eye of the hurricane. You're only half through it. But it's just like, you say things like, oh, you know what? Here's a perfect example. This relates back to hospitals. Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario had a series of tweets responding to the fact that there are more pediatric ICU patients than they have been previously. It was very even-handed, very rational, evidence-based. And it just occurred to me that someone in the comm staff at CHEO has realized the same thing you and I are talking about now, which is what we need to be happening is just tell the truth, tell it neutrally, and know you're going to get blowback here. We are absolutely seeing more kids with COVID or from COVID, I don't know whatever the terminology is, in hospitals and ICU. Of course we are. The base population that is currently infected with COVID is massively bigger across the board because it's fucking everywhere.
And of course it's going to be disproportionately more children because children aren't vaccinated. The same, right? Like, this is just a simple, straightforward math conversation.
You infect 10 times as many kids, even if it's half as virulent, it's mild, you're still going to end up with 5 times as many kids in the hospitals. Like,
that's right.
And this is incredibly easy, basic stuff that we ought to be able to explain. And I think if this was March 2020, maybe we would be able to explain this. January 2022, everybody's angry, we're pissed off, we're frustrated, we're mad at people. It's just getting harder and harder to talk about this, and
harder and harder to do basic, obvious communications.
One of my columns, by the time this video comes out, I'll have another one. It's already mostly written, but one of my columns this week for TVO, the Ontario Public Broadcaster, was numbers. It was just like, okay, so we shut the schools for an extra 8 days. This is what we achieved during those 8 days. It was a weird column because I actually didn't take a stand, right? Like, opinion columns are normally about, and here is what I think. I said what my opinion was. I said I don't think the school closure was warranted, but I said, guess what? Here is what 8 days bought us. Here's the number of vulnerable children who were vaccinated. Here's the number of booster shots that were administered to adults. Here's the number of first doses given to children. Like, all of this number is available in the Ontario government data sets. And I just put them out in the column and I said, 8 days of school closure bought us this. Was it worth it? Make up your own minds. And that's kind of what I'm, in a weird way, like I said, like, I don't exclude myself from the everybody's crazy mindset right now. I'm going full John Lennon here, hopefully without being shot to death eventually thing. Just give me some truth. Like, let's just talk about what the numbers are. Let's talk about what our remaining public health interventions are going to do. Let's have honest conversations about what's possible here. This is the kind of the spoiler for that future column I need to get around writing, because I've already interviewed the psychology expert. People get locked in on whatever views they have previously expressed.
Well, and this is why nobody talks about Sweden anymore. Remember at the outset of the pandemic, everybody was talking about Sweden because if you were anti-lockdown, Sweden was your model. And if you were pro-lockdown, you were waiting for Sweden to go to shit. And the problem is that as the pandemic wore on, it wasn't obvious that Sweden was either totally going to shit, nor was it obvious that it had totally dodged the bullet either. So nobody could make an easy case for their argument based on Sweden's metrics. And so as a result, we don't talk about Sweden anymore.
But what about Sweden must have appeared in my post media inbox 500 times. Like,
yeah, until it didn't anymore.
Yeah,
right?
Right. I haven't looked at Sweden's numbers in a year. Like,
nobody has, because Sweden's numbers did go up, and their hospitalizations did go up, and their death rates did go up, but it didn't go up I think like in proportion to the other comparable countries. You know what I mean? Like it was
Lost
so
a
like
lot more than their Nordic neighbors. That's what I
they
remember.
lost, yeah, right. They lost more than their Nordic neighbors, but like a lot less than other European
And like
neighbors. So
France.
that there was no,
Yeah.
so there was no easy
Yeah.
like understanding. Like you can't look at Sweden and it doesn't confirm anybody's narrative
Yeah.
easily. And so as a result, nobody talks about Sweden anymore. So anyway, that I think is an interesting point. We have two more sort of COVID related tidbits. One thing I wanted to say is that so I read Barry Weiss's thing. It was a Canadian teacher wrote this thing in Barry Weiss about what it's actually like in schools right now. One thing I actually want to work on is I'm trying to solicit an op-ed from a high school student right now just to talk about what their experience has been like. Yeah, student, because we haven't heard from students. Like students have not been given a voice in this. We've heard a lot from parents, we've heard a lot from moms, we've heard a lot from everybody, but I think arguably the demographic that has been most brutally affected. And I mean, listen, if you read Barry Weiss's the teacher's column, you know, we've essentially put teenagers and kids into a dystopian, institutionalized, bureaucratized hellhole for a disease that overwhelmingly does not affect them. And we've arguably made their lives harder than anybody else. They've overwhelmingly borne the burden of all of this. And like, you know, and then that tweet that went around earlier this week about, you know, some schools in Ontario apparently have no talking during lunch policies, so you can't even socialize with your.
All right, hang on.
Like,
You saw the tweet. Did you see who sent the tweet?
Who sent the tweet?
You looked at the tweet. You didn't look at who sent it.
I don't even remember. No.
It was Asher, my best friend. Who?
Oh yes, it was Asher. That's right. I retweeted. That's right, Asher.
This is one of my childhood good buddies who I've stayed close with. Just had.
I remember that now.
That went viral.
I even corresponded with him. But yeah. I mean, but stuff like this has just gone batshit. And like, I really think that we have allowed our anxieties as a society to overwhelm our good sense, and it's been kids who disproportionately have less political power and clout in society who are just bearing an absolutely unacceptable cost and burden of all of this. And I honestly think that there's something you said about, like, I think parents have to revolt. Like I think that honestly we need like nationwide people to start running for school board trustees on COVID sensible policies. I think that, you know, you should be calling your principals. I think you should be picketing outside your kids' schools if you can. Like, this has gone way too far. This is utterly pathological. It's insane. It's not science-based, and it's incredibly harmful to children, and it's got to stop. You know, somebody's like an adult has got to come into the room here.
What's interesting is that I am not an activist personality, and as journalists, we are not activists. Like, we don't, no, we can write passionately about the issues we care about. Like, I write about the military a ton because I care about it, but we're not activists. Like, I don't show up at protests. Like, that's not the job.
That's not my role.
But
that got me so angry. It got me so angry. That got me so angry.
Like, I would say my professional discretion is pressed right up against my personal anger. Like, that's what I would say. Like, a lot of the time the decisions we make are very clinical. It's like, well, people will send me a petition to be like, hey, can you sign this? I'm like, no, but I can write about it. Like, I'm not going to put my name on this. I mean, I'm not going to become a participant. Now, look, if it's some totally local community issue, yeah, whatever. Like, as a guy who lives here, I'll take a stand on this. But political issues, I don't get involved in them, except in my role as a guy in.
I'm like almost starting my Jen Gerson for school board trustee.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, we're not. I'm not.
All the dispassionate discretion is gone. Like, for me, it's like, I can't get involved. I can't get involved. I have to stay out of this. I can't get involved. I write about the school system. I write about education. I can't get involved. But holy shit, do I want to get involved? Yeah, so there's that. You know, the other thing we want to talk about, well, there's two angles here. Let's do the first one first. Are some of the politicians we assumed were doomed not doomed? And the reason I bring this up is because Ken Bosenkool wrote a piece for us this week where he basically said, here are some reasons why Jason Kenney could actually still hang on. You are on record believing he's done. In Ontario, what I have been doing is, I haven't written a ton about this yet, but we do have an election coming up in like 6 months, almost to the day. And what I'm just saying, this is one of those things where, like I said to you before, I'm just pointing out things that are objectively, uncontroversially true, and people are getting mad. There is every chance. If anything, I would say right now, the most likely outcome is Doug Ford being reelected. And
if that happens, I definitely will not put out a tweet saying, I guess Doug Ford was fine. I won't do that because that would be bad.
Be interesting. I would encourage you not to do that, but part of me would have clinical interest in seeing what happens. Look, the problem, and I was writing about this in the line just a couple of weeks ago, talking about Kathleen Wynne and how it's not enough to hate Doug Ford. You need to actually want to elect someone to replace him. And so that's kind of just one thing we might talk about, whether or not some of these guys that conventional wisdom tells you are dead are actually not dead. And it's interesting to think about what will happen to the progressives in Alberta, the moderates in Alberta, what will happen to the progressives and moderates in Ontario if Jason Kenney and Doug...
That'll be an interesting question and a very funny one.
And I don't know what would happen.
Here's the point that I just wanted to make, and it's tangential to the one that you did. But this week, Doug Ford went out and dug out cars. And this is one of those things that the Ford family got very famous and has built a very strong local constituency doing shit exactly like this. Rob Ford was exactly the same. I have I have a pothole in front of my house. Call up Rob Ford will fix it for you, and Rob Ford will fix it for you. And they did this for years and years and years and years. And this is why they actually gained a real, genuine political constituency.
Jen, sorry to interrupt you. Give me just 1 second here. My sister and brother-in-law had a dead tree in their front lawn, and Forestry Services was not dealing with this. Rob Ford was not their counselor, not even close. But my brother-in-law just went, you know what? Everybody's always saying Rob Ford will return calls. He calls up Rob Ford, goes, I'm not a constituent in your riding, your ward, but I've got a dead tree on my front yard. The city agrees it's dead. It's leaning over in every bit of wind here right toward my house. No one at the city will actually do anything about it. Rob Ford, before he was mayor, goes, okay. He says, thanks. Give me your number, give me your address, give me your name. Forestry Services had that tree gone in 72 hours.
Yeah, and this is so what Doug Ford is doing right here.
Stories like
100,000 stories like this, and this is why these guys were popular and are popular among the common man, hated by the media elite and loved by the common man. I mean, like this is the old trope, right? Yeah. But what Doug Ford is doing is classic Fordism, right? Like yes, of course, it's a media stunt that he's going around digging cars out of the snowbank. No shit, Sherlock. Media stunts is what politicians do. But what I think that I would probably add a point of counterintuitive defense of that thing is that he's also demonstrating the behavior that he wants to see his electorate demonstrate. This is a pretty classic 101 leadership thing. You can't get on a podium and be like, start helping out your neighbors, start digging out cars, but you can be seen in front of the cameras digging out your neighbors' cars. And in doing so, you're creating a model of behavior and demonstrating a form of leadership that you would like your constituency to follow in turn. Does this redeem anything that Doug Ford screwed up during the pandemic? No, of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. But him engaging in a media publicity stunt to demonstrate good neighborly behaviors and appropriate stuff like this, A, it's classic Ford, and B, it's actually pretty good leadership. It's a smart thing to do. It's a smart way to demonstrate being a good citizen.
You know where Doug fucked up? He did a live stream interview with a local TV channel while operating a motor vehicle.
Not wise.
That's also classic Ford.
That's also classic Ford.
They've had a lot of problems behind the wheel of their car.
Now, if he pulled out a crack pipe, that too would be classic Ford. But I'm not defending the Fords and everything they've ever done. But typically speaking, I mean, this is the same thing we saw during the floods in Calgary. It's like, you don't want politicians in an ivory tower telling you how to behave. You want to see them in the ground in an emergency, showing up to the scene, seeing for themselves what's going on, and in the best scenario, you want to see them helping out because that shows the rest of the community what they should be doing.
I'm actually way more cynical than you are on that. When there's an emergency, I want the leader 100 miles away in a bunker getting good advice. But I understand the political imperative, which is why they show up. Like, I'm more Vulcan left-brained on that. Like, I don't care where you are, make good
Yeah,
decisions.
but that assumes that most of the emergency management is necessarily done on a day-to-day thing by the premier, and like we know that that's not true.
Yeah, I know.
Most day-to-day emergencies handled by the civil service anyway, right?
I
So
just
like,
roll my eyes every time I see some politician with a bomber jacket, like at a sandbag site. Like, shut up, go home, like pass a bill. Like, I'm
yeah,
more cynical than you on this. I get
but
it.
politicians no, but politicians serve a really important symbolic function. And like I remember even before the 2013 floods, there was a big flood sort of out close to Medicine Hat in Alberta, and Ed Stelmach got into tons of shit because he was on vacation as opposed to being on the ground surveying the flood damage. And I have a funny story about that. But basically, like people expect their politicians to act in these symbolic ways in times of emergency and crisis. There's a certain ritual to this. And I don't think it was wrong for Doug Ford to do this. And I think a lot of the smarmy, sneering Twitter stuff is perfectly indicative of exactly why froggies on the left hate Doug Ford so much, and exactly why ordinary people like him and will vote for him.
You know what, for what it's worth, I do not disagree with your political analysis of why these people show up. It just doesn't work on me. Like, for whatever reason.
But you and I are weird.
No, and I admit I'm weird on this one. Like, this is one where I am just way outside the mainstream. Don't send me a politician, send me a Red Cross unit. Like, come on. Like, I get very pissed off about this. And one of the reasons I get pissed off about this is because you know what? The hell with it. It's I'll save it for a column. It's a whole thing.
Save it for a column.
I have written columns about this before. I get weirdly cranky about it, which is why I'm cutting myself off, or I would just go on a tangent here.
Stop, you cranky old man. Stop shaking your fist at the cloud.
So you and I we'd mentioned shoveling. It's on my list of notes where you and I each had a thought we wanted to offer it. I want to mention a couple of things. And one of them is that I'm a Toronto guy, born and raised, and I remember the Rob Ford, Doug Ford era at City Hall, where we kind of just alluded to some of those problems. I was manning a desk at Don Mills at the editorial board for the National Post then, like way up in the suburbs of the city. I was very rarely downtown at City Hall, but that era in Toronto political history was such even for me, a guy at a desk receiving the incoming copy and looking at this being like, holy shit, what the fuck happened today? Like, every day during that era was like that. What incredible training it was for everything that has happened since, because the world has not quite gone back on its old axis since then. And I'm not blaming Rob Ford, just coincidences, correlation, not causation. Like, the Rob Ford era was kind of at the beginning of a weird time for the world. Incredible practice, largely in our ability to just kind of go, oh, okay, well, I guess this is happening, and we skip over the whole, well, that's impossible, that could never happen phase. If you come through the Rob Ford era, your horizons to what is possible expand dramatically. The other point I would make, and it is related to something you were just saying. When I was looking at Doug Ford, Toronto had this huge blizzard, an actual genuine blizzard. Toronto normally gets like 5 centimeters. Everybody panics. This was a real Canadian winter storm that hit a very dense city, and it's a pain in the ass to clean up. I would only say the storm kind of rolled through Sunday, Monday. I would only say the city began really functioning again properly on Thursday. It took that long to dig it out. Doug Ford on Monday is driving around in his car with a shovel, and weirdly, some of his staff taking pictures of it, etc. So yeah, obviously, as you say, a stunt. What I think is interesting is I looked at the sneering reaction of many of the media commentators. The Toronto Star had an editorial saying, "Stop shoveling and get to work on the pandemic." And I thought to myself, this is why he's going to win.
Yeah, that's exactly my point.
Yeah, like
you're falling into exactly the same trap you fell into during the Rob Ford years. Exactly the same trap.
My buddy John Michael McGrath, he's a great columnist at TVO. He comes on my radio show. He wrote this incredibly sober, thoughtful, intelligent political analysis of where Ontario stands 6 months out before the next election. It is like, I don't disagree with a word of it. It is just a completely accurate, sober assessment. But what it doesn't include is the fact that every time the Toronto Star tells Doug to stop shoveling, every time the doctors on Twitter sneer at him, every time all the right thinking elites, and again, folks, I'm a downtown Toronto
You're a right thinking elite.
I am. Like I am a highly educated, no calluses on my hands, white collar professional with multiple university degrees living in the fucking center of the universe. I look at what my peers in that group are saying, and I'm thinking to myself,
Gonna do it
you
again.
are re-electing Doug Ford. And the thing is too,
because our peers don't realize that people hate us more than they hate Doug Ford.
Well, no,
you don't get it. However much people hate Doug Kenney right now, they hate us more. So like factor that into your calculations accordingly.
You just said Doug Kenney, which we should probably put in the headline.
Whatever, same thing.
Well, you know what? I basically agree with you, but with one small proviso. What I had said a few days ago, it was interesting how quickly I heard from very senior liberals and conservatives, big names, everybody would recognize them. All I tweeted was that one thing that Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau have in common is that the broader public does not hate them nearly as much as their sharpest critics believe the broader public hates them. And I remember telling, I can't tell you who it was, a federal conservative with immediate national name recognition. How about we go with that? And I said to this person years ago, very early in Justin Trudeau's first term, this person was telling me Canadians are going to get one look at this guy and they're going to come running back to us. And I said, no, he's a 3-term prime minister. And they said, no, Gurney, you're wrong. Said this guy, Canadians are going to take one look at this guy and they're going to realize they were wrong, that we should never have gotten rid of Harper. This guy was not Harper, by the way, but he was someone who was part of the Harper cadre. It was like, no, they're going to take one look at Trudeau. I'm like, no, Canadians don't hate him as much as you do. This is a youth thing, and this is a conservative party thing in general, and this is a conservative movement thing in general. Trudeau is under your skin in a way that has warped your worldview, and you think that there's almost 40 million Canadians out there who see the same thing you do when you look at Trudeau. I said there are millions of Canadians who look at him and think he's such a nice boy. There's a million Canadians who can go, oh, look at him, such a prog, such a good guy, heart in the right place. A lot of them look at him and go, well, I liked his dad, and, I'll vote for this guy. And the partisans are a small group in this country, right? Like the vast majority of Canadians are not partisans for any party.
You're not a normie.
Yeah, and like the conservative partisans believe passionately, or believed, I guess maybe they've woken up now, that the rest of us hated Trudeau as much as they do. And you cannot convince them they're wrong. You cannot convince them that there are millions of Canadians that have no opinion about Justin Trudeau or like the guy. It's just like, it doesn't compute to them. And it's kind of like when it's like, hey, do you like pizza? No, I don't like pizza. What do you mean? I love pizza. People don't get it. And what I said was that if there's one thing Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford have in common, it's that, but it's from different sides of the political spectrum.
That's right.
There are people on the left, I even say the moderate middle, who are 100% convinced that no one will possibly even consider ever voting for a Ford again. And I think it's, hey, I'm betting on Doug Ford winning right now. If I was to put money down, I wouldn't put much down because who cares 6 months out, but I would bet on a Doug Ford re-election.
Basically, what we're arguing here is that both Justin Trudeau and Doug Ford are fine.
Or they will be fine.
Or neither, or literally no one's been fine. It depends on what you're talking about. I want to go on a little bit here because
let me just finish the one thought.
Finish your point. I apologize.
If Ford loses, which is possible, he's still going to lose with like 35% of the vote.
Yeah.
Like his numbers are not going to drop that much. And like people, like even if he loses, the day after the election, there will be a million hot takes going, how could 35% of voters have voted for this?
How could this have happened? How is that possible?
How is it possible that like a million, or whatever the vote tally is, I don't know what vote turnout in Ontario is, but how could a million people have voted for this guy, or 500,000 or whatever it is? He is going to get, he might lose because in our parliamentary system, enough ridings might elect someone who's not a conservative. But Doug Ford is going to win somewhere between 30 and 40% of the vote. And that's going to blow minds who, like I said before, all you got to do is tell these people the truth. They just can't perceive it here. And Justin Trudeau is the same thing.
I agree. I want to just finish up with a real quick thing about Ukraine, just because Ukraine is appearing to be more and more of a thing. I don't know if we want to make any comment about Melanie Jolie's visit there. I mean, it's clear that polling numbers are pretty firmly against Russia, because like we seem to be taking some pretty unwishy-washy stands in Ukraine's favor. I don't know if that's really about trying
to live in Canada, like, or like what
a bunch of Ukrainians live in Canada. There's a really strong diaspora. They're a big political constituency, and they're an active political constituency.
I know.
And then the other thing that's interesting in all of this, yes, and then the other thing that's interesting in all of this is that I wonder how much of this is about trying to get back in the good books of NATO. How much of this is demonstrating that no, we're part of the alliance too. Remember us? I think that they're shit. Well, Jolie's there for a reason. They're making very strong, and like also let's be blunt, the Ukrainian political constituency is not liberal. They're conservative. So that's really interesting. So that might be worth noting. What's also worth noting to me, and what I think is very interesting, is that I was listening to CBC, sort of a call-in show about what was happening in Ukraine and Russia. They did actually, it was a very good little call-in show. Give them props, and they had a really smart historian who I really want to try to talk to, because he sounded interesting. But what was clear to me is that a lot of people have very uncritically digested quite a lot of Russian talking points about Ukraine. The one that's most interesting to me is that they're saying, what a lot of people seem to forget is that a lot of Ukrainians were Nazis during the war. And that one comes up again and again and again. A couple of points. One is, yes, that's true. And it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
Anybody who brings up the fact that a lot of Ukrainians were Nazis during the war, but doesn't also bring up the fact that, Stalin tried to and successfully murdered and starved a couple million of them, is not bringing that fact up for increased historical literacy and context. Somebody who is bringing one of those facts up but not the other is basically trying to make Ukraine look bad.
Yep.
By historical context. And then the other interesting reason why I think that talking point is interesting is, of course, Germany is now our ally, is in NATO. You know what the biggest source of Nazis was during the World War? Germany. And yet
I've heard that rumor.
And yet for some reason we don't think it wouldn't be acceptable for Russia to invade Germany. You know what I mean? Because they were Nazis during the war. I mean, like it's an insane talking point. And the other thing that this historian brought up during this call-in show was like, there's a lot of anti-Ukrainian propaganda coming out of Russia. Just so you know, right now, the president of Russia is a Jew. So just to clarify.
I got a fact check you there. You meant Ukraine.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ukraine. Yeah. I apologize, Ukraine. Anyway, point
You're right.
being,
your point is that these guys aren't the Nazis.
Yeah, these guys aren't the Nazis, and you can't paint them as Nazis in order to justify a Russian invasion in 2022. That makes no fucking sense at all.
No, and so I do know my history. There were a ton of Ukrainian Nazis,
there were 100%
with the Third Reich against the Soviets who had been occupying them. And there are neo-fascist, neo-Nazis active in Ukraine today. But imagine if Russia invades us and the Americans go, yeah, but the Canadians have Proud Boys. So we're not.
Well, and also what's also really interesting is there are also some really horrifying and fascinating Nazi memorials in Canadian cemeteries, in Ukrainian Canadian cemeteries. It's a fascinating story. It really, really is interesting. And if I could get someone to write about it in a historically contextualized way, I'd be totally happy to have that story at the line. The problem is that all the people who pitch me that story are tankies, and they all want to talk about how all the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada are really neo-Nazis. And then you start saying, it's like, okay, you want to write that story, that's fine. but then we're going to have to talk about the Holodomor. Oh, no, 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 I don't want to show. No, 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 that, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, so you're being fed talking points by the Soviet Union. Okay, cool. Just like, like it's such an obvious tell for me. But anyway, the thing I just think it's worth bringing up is like, I don't actually think there's much of an argument for Canada being involved if Russia does choose to invade Ukraine. I don't even think there's much of an argument for NATO involving itself in all of this. This isn't really our problem. We don't have the resources to devote to this right now. And bluntly, I just don't think we want to go to war with Russia. Like there's a lot of totally rational reasons why we just want to stay out of this and let Russia do its thing. But because a lot of Ukrainians were Nazis is not one of them.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I agree with you. I don't want to go to war with Russia. And people who read my column tomorrow are going to get a real at the line. Actually, you know what? By the time this video is out, people will have had the opportunity to read that column. They're going to have a pretty good sense of why I don't want to go to war with Russia. The only thing that worries me, Jen, well, 2 points. I think I told you this once before. I went to school with a woman, a grad school, a really nice, smart woman. I got nothing but good things to say about her. And she was from Eastern Europe. And it was really interesting just to look at the differences between historical understanding of the different parties of the Second World War when you had grown up in a post-Soviet country compared to a Western country. I'm not judging anybody. I'm not being hard on anyone here, but like, I shouldn't laugh. In lectures where it's like talking about things the Soviets did, looking over at her, just kind of out of curiosity, I just kind of look over across the room and look at her, and her face is just bewildered. She's like, that didn't happen. What do you mean? That never happened. And it was like, So when we hear Ukrainians like and Russians yelling at each other about this stuff, we thought history ended there in 1991. As far as they're concerned, it has just been one long unbroken streak since way before any of us were born.
Yep. They call it for the Bloodlands for a reason.
I was going to mention Applebaum's book was incredible about this, talking about what it was like to be the smaller countries and empires crushed between German imperialism in different forms and Russian imperialism in different forms. It's an interesting time and place.
Sorry, I don't really want to get into a big historical debate, but what I do think is interesting is like that particular talking point is a huge yellow flag for me. Like it's a really interesting, to me, I'm like, okay, the second I hear someone saying that Ukraine is bad because they were Nazis during World War II, back when, like, I'm sorry, although those people are dead now, I'm just like, okay, you're getting your information directly from RT or whatever. Like, you know what I mean? Like I kind of instantly dismiss them as a source.
What I find interesting, though, I agree with you that we don't want to be in a war with Russia.
No,
we are not treaty obligated to defend the.
We're not treaty obligated.
They're not part of NATO.
We've got other problems. We've got other potentially like there are places we need to hold our smoke.
The problem. The only problem is, Jen, this is exactly what people a lot like us were saying 80 years ago about the Sudetenland, about Austria, about Poland. The one problem I always have with Putin is I don't want to fight this guy. No, does he stop with Ukraine?
Like I think the West is going to have a conversation about where our actual red lines are. Is our red line Ukraine?
It's not, but I'm not sure we have a red line.
But I do think we do need to have a conversation about what that red line is.
I mean, in theory, it's the NATO countries, but
in theory, it's the NATO countries. But in practice, how is that going to stand? So
Canada's
I don't know. I'm hoping future historians look back on this little podcast of ours kindly and don't judge us too harshly for our unwillingness. Like, we just came out of a pandemic, everyone. Our inflation's going to go through the shit. Our truckers are protest. Like, we have other problems going on right now. I just don't think we've got the energy to go to war with Russia right now. Okay, I'm sorry.
Have you seen the movie Kingpin?
No.
It's a really funny movie. See it. Not kid friendly though. Just you and your better half watch it. But there's this guy who's basically a guy was very famous once, and then there's like a tragedy, and he goes to ground, and then he kind of reemerges 20 years later, and he keeps hearing his own last name used as a verb, and he doesn't understand it. And he finds out that in the interim, after his tragic ending of his career, his name, which is Munson, has just become synonymous with blowing it all, total failure. and it's like nobody knows that this is Munson anymore, but it's like people are going like, oh yeah, my son, he was in high school and he tore out his knee, a total Munson. He's like, what? And he keeps hearing his name and no one can explain it to him except it means to have just blown your shot. And I'm just hoping now in the 22nd century, people aren't like, yeah, well, unfortunately, that was a bit of a Gerson, appeasement. It's just, I do worry that we have to remember the right lessons from history. And I don't think anybody came out of the 30s wanting appeasement, but I also, in 2022, I don't want to go to war with Putin to save the Ukrainians.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't think it's appeasement. I think it's just a realistic look of what we're capable of doing.
Well, we could beat Russia if we cared. We just don't.
Could we? Well, could we beat Russia and China? Like because that's my other thing is that I don't think Russia's our only problem right now. Like that's, and that's the issue. I think we have some serious economic problems. I think especially in Canada, we obviously have no military left, but and on top of that, we also have China to deal with. So like I think to some extent we have to sort of what's not the phrase I'm looking for. It's not hold your smoke. It's like not blow your load on the first provocation that comes along. Like, you know what I mean? I think we're going to have lots of problems. We're going to have lots of opportunities to go to world war. This probably isn't the one.
Keep your powder dry. Is that what you mean?
Keep your powder dry. That's right. That's a good military metaphor. I think to some extent we might have to keep our powder dry on this one. And is it powder? That's what I said. Powder.
Keeping it dry. We need powder. That's what we need.
Exactly. Exactly. We need powder. We actually need to have the capability to go to war before we go to war. And I'm not sure that we have that. I'm not sure that we have it socially. I'm not sure the social fabric's there. I don't think the capability for total mobilization is there psychologically. And not for
Ukraine, probably not for Taiwan either.
So like, anyway, like I said, I don't think this is appeasement. I think this is just like, would love to help, can't.
Well, what I would, the only thing I would say, and again, this is me being the history nerd, if you wanted to make one rational argument in favor of throwing the Czechoslovakians under the bus in 36, was it 38? I think it was, I have to go check that. I think Anschluss was 36 and Czechs were 38. Anyway, it bought the British time to build the RAF. And the planes they built in the late 30s, the Hurricanes and the Spitfires, were the planes that won the Battle of Britain.
So maybe we need to learn the immediate lessons of our direct history, which is that lockdowns only prolong the pandemic. Yeah. They only buy you time. So what are you using that time to do? And so maybe there's just a similar parallel to be made here. Sacrificing Ukraine will buy us time. What are we using that time to do?
I would feel better. And sorry, Ukrainians. Like I think what's about to happen to you guys in all likelihood is going to suck, and you don't deserve it. But we probably can't stop it. And I'd feel better watching Ukraine and Taiwan go down if I had any confidence that I actually would spur a conversation among the democracies that it's time to get our game face back on.
Hopefully.
But I don't think it would. All right. Well, we've got a lot to talk about. What do you want to write?
All right. Angry parents, Barry Weiss, time to revolt. Revolt. I'll take revolt.
And you want to do a hospital comparison?
Hospital comparison.
All right. I will do the Doug Ford, Jason Kenney stuff. And
can I do Doug Ford digging? Doug Ford digging and how that's actually a good symbolic
You want to
gesture.
do it, or you want me to do it?
Well, I think there's two different pieces here.
Okay, so you do Doug Ford moral leadership. I will do progressive.
That'll lead into yours.
Doug Ford, and possibly Jason Kenney, and I'll also do the Trudeau Ford hatred thing, which will all be part of the same blurb.
Yeah.
And then
do you want me to take on Ukraine, or shall you? I mean, you're more the history buff than I am, but
I probably should do that.
This is probably you. Okay. Not that I'm stupid. I'm not stupid, Matt Garney. No, I am a little. That's fine.
You know what? Most of us don't know our history.
It's true.
No, it's.
I mean, I don't think I said anything on this video that was historically inaccurate.
No, I did. I just worry people are going to follow you around with umbrellas.
Fair.
You don't know it that.
Yes, it's because the
Chamberlain.
Russians killed with.
No. Chamberlain always walked around with an umbrella. So after Munich and all that stuff, an umbrella became a symbol of appeasement.
Oh,
Mainly,
I
I'm just
thought you were talking
you,
about when Russia. I think when who did Russia poison? The Ukrainian
they've poisoned a lot
president with the tip of an umbrella. I thought that was anyway.
I just mainly worried a lot of Ukrainians are going to be mad at you, and probably me, but maybe to a lesser extent because
But I'm kind of defending them. So why? Oh, because we're just like sorry, Russia's going to invade you, and we're not going to do anything about it.
Well, have you had a chance to read my column draft yet, which will be public by the time?
No, I read the one that we talked about before, but not the one not since you updated it.
I have substantially reworked it.
Okay.
I think we should avoid war with Russia if possible. That's my hot take. But I don't know. I'm not an optimist on the 21st century. I'm a long-term optimist. I think the 2300 is going to be great. I'm just we have to get there first. Remember, I'm a Trekkie. As far as I'm concerned, we're one warp drive leap away from paradise.
Let's hope so. Anyway, we should probably put it off there.
Anything else? That's it.
That's it.
I hope you feel better.
Me too.
Thanks, everybody. This has been a long, rambly video. We've mentioned a couple times we want to get a podcast going. I'm running into a couple technical barriers there. I think I've got it figured out. Jen, I think what we'd probably have to do is rip out a section of this, put a little intro and extra on the back of it, and then roll with it. So, all right. That's it. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Hey.